After Jesus had warned of money-hungry false teachers, he next told his disciples to expect an increase of war. He said, "And you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom." So the second thing that we're looking for that indicates that the end is getting near is an increase of war. Notice what Jesus says though, that the end won't follow immediately. Just like false teachers, increasing violence is only a very early sign. Just because we see it happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that the end is imminent. But the question here, of course, is, do we see it happening? Is war increasing? That's the question that we're going to answer in episode 2. That there is a lot of war in the world is one of the most easily verifiable facts of life. It's everywhere and it's impossible to ignore. Turn on the news right now and within minutes or even seconds you're going to hear about war. Open a newspaper and it's the same thing, you're going to read about war. Go into your social media accounts, turn on the radio, it doesn't matter where you turn, you are going to hear about war. Images like these have become so common that they don't even really shock us anymore. We're used to seeing shattered buildings and tanks and guns and refugees on our screens because there's just so much of it. This has become our normal. And we're used to hearing about threats of war too, whether it be North Korea or Russia or somewhere else. We know from sheer experience that there is a lot of conflict on planet Earth. Now, of course, it would be easy to argue that there has always been war in the world. It's just always been this way. So the real question that we need to ask in this episode is war increasing? Is it getting worse? Is it affecting more people? And for the answer to that question, we need to start looking at some hard data. The most complete study on this topic to date was produced in 2011 by Professors Mark Harrison from the University of Warwick and Nicholas Wolf from Humboldt University. They concluded, quote, "Wars are increasingly frequent and the trend has been steadily upward since 1870. Indeed, they discovered that between 1870 and 2001, the frequency of wars between states increased steadily by 2% a year on average." Harrison commented, "The number of conflicts has been rising on a stable trend. Because of 2 world wars, the pattern is obviously disturbed between 1914 and 1945, but remarkably, after 1945, the frequency of wars resumed its upward course on pretty much the same path as before 1913. In basic terms then, for over 130 years, the nations of the world have become measurably more hostile towards each other." Now, the interesting thing here is that few people predicted this pattern. The Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century anticipated that as countries became more prosperous, democratic, and interdependent on each other through trade, there would be fewer reasons for their leaders to go to war with each other. Indeed, most political scientists today still hold to this theory. And yet, that isn't what's happened. The world has indeed moved towards prosperity, democracy, and trading interdependence, but it hasn't produced this decrease in war that everyone thought it would. At least, not until recently. In recent years, there has been a glimmer of hope for this theory. Bearing in mind that Harrison and Wolf produced their report in 2011 and that their data stopped at 2001, we now have some more recent information to add. The Peace Research Institute of Oslo produced this updated graph in 2016. And as you can see from it, although wars gradually did rise until 1991, the ending of the Cold War at that time marked something of a reversal. Between 1991 and 2001, where Harrison and Wolf's data ended, there were actually 10 years of gradual decline. Indeed, even between 2001 and 2011, you can see that the number of conflicts remained lower than at any time since the 1970s. So could it be that after 130 years of escalating war, we are indeed finally witnessing the beginning of a long-term advancement towards peace? Political scientists again certainly hope so, and in recent years, they even coined the term the waning of war to express this observation. And yet, notice the spike at the end of the graph in 2016, which brought conflicts right back up again to 1991 levels. The Oslo Institute commented on this recent spike in the report, saying, "The level of violence currently seen is higher than any other time in the post-Cold War period. They continued, "Since 1992, just after the end of the Cold War, the number of armed conflicts in the world fell continuously. Since 2013, however, we have seen a rise in both the number of conflicts and battle casualties. Nationalism and religious extremism lie behind much of this uptick." So we're back on an uptick again, experiencing high levels of violence. The International Institute for Strategic Studies discovered that the number of deaths from war more than trebled between 2008 and 2015 due to an inexorable intensification in violence. The World Bank recently added its findings too, saying that 1.2 billion people, a fifth of the planet's population, are currently being negatively affected by war, and according to them, that's the highest figure since World War II. So why isn't this theory working? Well, here are 3 reasons. Number 1, the World Bank says that although prosperity, democracy and trade may eventually produce peace in the world, democratization and institutional transition can lead to conflict. In other words, things tend to get worse before they get better. Before a country becomes free, it needs to go through revolutions and infighting as various factions try to assert their vision for the future. And since 70 of the world's nations have still to go through that process of becoming democratic, the world is likely to experience trouble, at least for the foreseeable future. Number 2, many countries of the world don't actually want democracy and peaceful trading interdependence. Islam, for example, is inherently opposed to democracy. Now, the core of Islamic ideology is not living in peaceful codependence with the other nations of the world, but rather trying to conquer those nations and then putting them under Sharia law. Indeed, since this must happen according to Islamic prophecy, if it doesn't, then their faith will be exposed as a sham. And to many Muslims then, succumbing to democracy would be a denial of their own religion, their culture, Muhammad and Allah himself, and as such, it's simply out of the question. Islam compels them to continue fighting against the democratic nations of the world so that Islamic dominance might one day be established. And so the bottom line then is that peace will never exist in this world as long as Islam has any kind of influence over human minds. Number 3, Harrison and Wolff say that although trade and democracy are traditionally thought of as goods because they reduce the willingness to go to war, the same factors increase the capacity for war. Namely, prosperous countries can afford it. They can afford to go to war. And of course, the sinful human nature means that there will always be reasons to. So, not only have wars been increasing for the past 130 years, but there are very good reasons to believe that war is going to continue in the years to come. Remember what Jesus said. He said that in the last days you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Jesus said that war would increase, and it has. Every time you turn on the news and see images like this, you are witnessing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.